Welcome to another episode of Management Muse. I'm your host, Cindi Baldi, and this is my husband and co-host, Geoffrey Tumlin.
Yellow! Welcome to the podcast where we try to inspire better work performance. Thanks for listening.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on Management Muse. I am your host, Cindi Baldi, and across the way is Geoffrey Tumlin.
Yellow.
And today we are going to talk about why it's so hard to see people accurately and how that screws up what we do as managers.
I got a lot of examples.
All right, you go.
I could go all day long.
All right, go for it, honey.
So we're working, it's been a few years ago in a company. You and email to figure this one out. And I was explaining the fundamental attribution error, which basically is kind of a pile-on effect, and saying that the implications of that are basically when we have a favorable attribution of people, we think they're really good and this and that just tends to lead to more and more selective attention on the things they do well and discounting when they don't do something well. And then when people are behind the eight ball, they get a couple missteps early on, or they do a couple of big things wrong, they kind of slip into purgatory and we put them in jail and we don't let them out. And even when they do good things, we tend to discount that and we make them eat all the bad things that happen. And as I was explaining this, the executives in the room, like their mouths came open and I'm like, what just happened? And they were like, this person, they said a name, it was whatever, Chuck, let's say, this person, Chuck, I think we've done that. And like the CEO nodded and the CFO nodded and the two, Chuck wasn't in the room, but the couple other senior leaders were like, yeah, we did that. So he told me the backstory and he came on and he made a couple of errors early on and it disrupted things with clients. And basically everybody still held that against him, even though that happened. He'd been to the company probably by 2 years by then. And that happened in the first 90 days. And all the rest of his work had been really good. And he brought in a lot more clients and he disrupted, basically been a really good employee, a really good addition to the team. But they hadn't let him out of jail. They kept basically discounting his successes and making him eat his failures. The science of this is, the science of what we're talking about is Geoff, or you listening to this, whatever your name is, you're listening to this, Rich Gussenhoven, if you're listening to this, or Jim Young, if you're listening to this, or my aunt. I know she likes to listen to.
Oh,
or Mike Granberry.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. My cousin. That's like, we've been lately finding more and more listeners when we're just kind of out meeting people. So that's been kind of cool. Anyway, the science behind this is fundamental attribution error, which is when Geoff, do something and it succeeds, I overemphasize how much of that was my own agency. I did this. And I discount how much of it was luck or timing or the fact that I got the promotion because the two people better than me took jobs in Florida and moved out of state.
And so basically the situation.
Yes. But the other piece of that is I don't extend that courtesy to other people.
Oh, you do the opposite for other people. So for other people, you tend to, if something positive happens, you tend to give more credit to the situation than the person.
More of a discount.
Right. But if something negative happens, you lay all the blame at the feet of the person.
They did.
And none at the situation. That it's just a tendency.
Yeah.
There is a caveat to that. Are we going to get into that caveat?
We're going to get into everything.
So at least
wake up, nerds.
The caveat.
Wake up, nerds. The master is cracking her knuckles.
The caveat.
This is what she got her PhD in.
Yes, it is. And I do love it, although lately it's been so in my face for all the bad things that it brings that I've not been so fond of it. But ultimately, I love it always.
No, I get it.
So the one caveat that I was thinking of with fundamental attribution error is that this reversal that happens from ourselves and how we treat ourselves with positive or negative things versus others, well, that changes again when we identify with the person. So as soon as I identify with the person that I'm observing, it means that if something positive happens, I think it's all them. And if something negative happens, I think it's all situation. So
yes, they get our bias.
Right. Yeah. Generally, that it's a condition under which the attribution error does not work as it normally does.
Yeah.
I can see now where you were going with the fundamental attribution error, because when he screwed up fast, you attributed it, or they attributed it to something being faulty in him.
Yep.
The problem is that he was never able to dig out of that, because confirmation bias says once we have a hypothesis about somebody, we basically only attend to information that confirms that hypothesis. So once the attribution error caused you to have a negative hypothesis about somebody, then it doesn't matter that they do 100 things that are great. You're only paying attention to the times that they screw up.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a serious topic. It's got a ton of different science and bias behind it. The basic thing that makes it important for managers, it's very hard to accurately see people. And obviously that's a problem as a manager, where we're making decisions about who do we promote, who do we give a raise to, who do we select for an assignment, and so forth. And so we're trying to work through some of the most common biases and then give you some ways around it, try to see people more accurately. So what Cindy's saying is right, is that once you have something in your head about someone's performance, especially if they have some early mistakes, it's like dating, right? It's like if you dated somebody 5 times and the 5th date isn't that great, you probably still get a 6th date because you had 1, 2, 3, 4 were pretty decent. But if the first date is bad, there's never a second date. And so that is where the idea by Edwin Hollander many years ago called idiosyncrasy credits that spawned the more common term goodwill account comes into play, which is basically the metaphor of you got a relational bank account and you put in deposits. When you do good stuff, you make withdrawals when you screw up. And if you make withdrawals and you make them early and you get overdrawn, a negative balance, so to speak, that's like being in jail. That's like the attribution is shifting against you. And so now I'm looking at you and I'm thinking, this person tends to mess up, or this person tends to not follow through on what they're saying, because I've only known you for a month or 45 days or 2 months. And in 2 or 3 times working with you, or twice, let's say, it's probably enough, you haven't followed through. And so now I'm like, well, this person doesn't follow through. And that holds. That attribution, attribution is just a funny word for, now we're getting into my dissertation somehow. This covers both of our dissertations. We're getting into attribution is just a fancy word for the ways that we seek to explain other people's behavior. And there is a study, it's years ago, I don't even know if I could ever find it again, but basically the idea was it was kind of went around the block when I was in graduate school of in relationships, we tend to figure out what the roles are people play in about 6 months or so. And then it kind of gets locked in.
Yeah, that's a social contract.
Yeah. And then, all right, it's locked in and you're like this and I'm like this and you do this and I do this. And we don't update it fast enough, even though people change. So Cindy was talking about earlier how when we tightly identify with somebody, which is basically we feel like it's more than just liking. It's
the more similar we perceive them to be to us.
We extend the same bias.
Yeah.
Of fundamental attribution error, of allowing them extra credit for victories and finding reasons to discount when they come up short. And so that leads to an example. It's been a couple years now, but there's a place we worked. Basically, it was a big IT company. And they did a lot of cool stuff with their IT. And they'd had a new senior manager brought in. And during coaching, she's like, hey, I got a question for you. I said, okay, what is it? She said, we've got a couple teams here that they're good, but they're not great. And everybody thinks they're great and is unwilling to basically tell them they're not as great as they think. And I'm like, well, what teams are they? And she named off 2 teams, and they were both very like multi-year teams led by respected managers, had a lot of kind of victories and big projects in the company. And I'm like, tell me more. And so she gave me a couple examples, and basically I was like, oh crap, I think she's right. Like what she's saying makes sense. It was kind of deep inside coding baseball, but I got the gist of what she was saying. She was explaining it to me in a way that I could understand. And I said, that's haloing. She's like, what? I said, look, these 2 groups were kind of led by very esteemed managers. And some of the people on the groups have done stayed up all night in years past, putting projects together and bringing things in on the deadline. And so they've got this aura about them. And I think you're right. People probably aren't telling them the areas where they're falling short or how they could be better because they've got this halo around them. The reason that this is a problem, all of this stuff we're talking about is manager's job is to try to see people accurately, but there's a lot of bias that gets in the way.
I mean, it's like all bias, right? Like we don't even realize that we're biased. So we think we are seeing people accurately. But once you understand that these are biases that tend to happen, then you can start, you're going to have that initial instinct, oh, that person's jacked up.
Yeah.
But then you can step back and go, well, is that person jacked up, or do I need to look at the situation?
Yeah. Yeah. Like the antidotes, as you just mentioned, the first antidote is awareness, but the antidotes are actually very crisp and they fall right out of understanding the bias. So for fundamental attribution error, the antidote is to be a little more intentional about asking yourself how much of this victory was actually me versus getting lucky, timing, situation.
Well, I'm thinking of if you're a manager, you're evaluating other people. So how much of this was actually them versus the situation, knowing that you're going to have a tendency to overestimate the situation. And, if it's good, you're going to overestimate the situation. If it's bad, you're going to lay it all on the person. And so trying to counterbalance the bias by re-examining it.
Yeah. And that's assuming you don't identify or you don't kind of like the person. What percent of managers would you say don't identify with their direct reports? I know this can't be answered.
I think that's more the norm than not.
You think the more norm is that we're going to discount their successes. We're going to discount their successes by overestimating the situation for them and not give them full credit for their victories. That's the natural way it leans.
Yeah, we see it all the time. This is one of the things that you and I do is that we point out, their boss is upset with them for whatever their job performance is. And you and I are coming in and we're looking at it, and this is the 5th person in that position.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And we're
I know exactly what you're thinking about.
And
right
we're
now.
It's time to
That's
actually
right.
think about it's
what
probably not the person,
right.
and it's probably the system is jacked up.
Yeah, what is wrong with
and
the way
and that happens all the time.
Yep.
That seems to be more the tendency than anything. And so I don't think you literally have to see yourself or see. Yeah, you literally have to see yourself in them. That is identification. There's an overlap in how you're defining them and yourself. And that I don't think happens all the time. I think the more norm is you may or may not have any say over who works for you, depending on your position.
Yeah.
And most of the time, you might like them. There might be some things that you have in common, but most of the time you're not like, oh yeah, I was that person.
Yeah.
At one point in time. And I want to mentor that person because of that.
Yeah. 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 And so a more proper accounting would acknowledge that.
Yeah, you should go into, I think the counter to that is you should assume everybody's going to screw up in the beginning. You don't know where.
Yeah.
You don't know where they're going to screw up because they come in with like different experiences, different skills. But everybody's going to screw up while they're learning a system.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that you should be collecting or taking anything out of their bank.
Yeah.
Initially.
Right. Yeah. That's the goal. I mean, that's not what happens, but that's why we're having this conversation, to try to encourage people to the extent humanly possible, see people more accurately. Again, especially for managers who, to a certain extent, hold some of the professional fate of people in their hands. I think this is kind of an extreme way of saying it, but obviously it's the manager that does the performance reviews. It's the manager that encourages the promotion or the raise or the bonus and so forth.
It's the manager who's going to step in and be like, hey, like, you aren't doing this right. Let me show you how to do it. Or not. Hello, Musers. Now it's time for commercial break.
Let's talk about your survey. We just had a rush of, quite a few folks in wanting Cindy's survey. Think about measuring the internal health of your company. If you could get a good picture of who talks to whom, what your culture actually is, how your employees are actually feeling, and the way that they perceive their relationships are with their managers. That's Cindy's company health survey product, sometimes called the comprehensive internal health of the company. You can get that through Culsure, CULSURE.com. That's Cindy's company. I cannot think of anybody who's ever gotten it only once. People get this survey, they get the data, Cindy does a debrief for you, and people sign up for it year after year after year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great product, Culsure.com, CULSURE.
Call us.
I'm reminded of Marcus Buckingham wrote a book. It's been a few years. I think it's called like 7 Lies We Tell About Work or something like that.
Mm.
And one of the chapters, which spawned an article in HBR, was making the case that we can't actually evaluate people.
Yeah, I remember that.
There should not be any appraisals. Nothing should be tied to what a manager thinks of his or her people, because there's no way to get around all these biases. And so it's basically ingraining a flawed system in an organization. And I don't think you and I are that. I'm not that extreme.
No, that's kind of like libertarian, right? Like it's kind of a extreme version of a philosophy.
Yeah. That's like if somebody, I read once, I forget who said it. It's not me who said this. Somebody said, libertarian is what everybody believes in high school or something like that. And so, yeah. And, the spirit of where Buckingham was going is kind of a little bit of the spirit of what we're saying, but you wouldn't
go that far.
Yeah. Our limit is, as you convinced me many years ago, is to separate the systems for development, how we're coaching and developing people, from the systems of
appraisal,
performance review, and you say also take the money out of the performance review, right?
No, take the cost of living out of the performance appraisal. Like cost of living is, you worked here last year, cost of living increased 3%. Like
Right.
that should not.
No,
that
that's
should not
the way
come
that
off
cheap
based on-
companies. That's the way that cheap companies disguise a non-raise, basically.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's a bit extreme, but if you're putting 2%.
I mean, I realize that some companies, that's all they have, and that's what they're doing. But like then make a decision that it's not going to be 3%, and just give them whatever percent across the board for reaching the bar, the adequate bar to continue working here. And then for the people who actually did exceptional work, give them a bonus that is above and beyond that. But like, you shouldn't have to prove that like you're an exceptional employee in order to get 3% or whatever the cost of living is.
Yeah. We should, at some point, probably do a more in-depth coverage of evaluation and performance and development and kind of some of our ideas on that. But for today, I think it's fair to say we are pro evaluation, pro appraisal, pro performance review. To make them better, some of these biases that we're talking about, you've got to kind of iron out of the system, or else it'll be increasingly difficult to get a good measure of how people are doing.
Yeah, I think what I think about is what we heard today. We were at a ceremony of sorts, and I can't remember exactly the wording, but basically like, just because I can't do everything doesn't mean I don't do
something.
Yeah. And so just because we're not perfect with our perception doesn't mean that we shouldn't do what we can do to make it more perfect and do something. Because we can't just throw up our arms and do nothing, because then like, how do you even proceed?
Yeah. An indispensable managerial function is feedback and coaching.
Right.
And so we need to be having these conversations, but our
goal is to just help you have maybe
more precise.
Yeah. I think your earlier story, what is interesting in that is obviously you can see how somebody could be penalized for this and it would be a negative, right? Like it's the system and not really their fault, but they're getting the blame laid at their feet. But the opposite, I think, is also interesting, that when they have the more favorable attribution, more self-referencing attribution, where, they actually are probably not doing something to the best of their ability, and they could. Like it's actually a them issue, but you're like, oh, it's a situation.
Right.
And
yeah.
And so like they're getting hurt in the sense that they're not really being developed properly.
Question. Yeah.
But also the organization is getting hurt because we could have better work.
Yeah. People's potential development is hurt on both sides of this equation, to your point. I mean, it's obviously on the downside if we have somebody in jail, so to speak, but also on the upside, because as we put the halo around people, we basically pull our punches. And because of what you just said, we assume, it wasn't them. It was a situation out of their control. We're often we're not giving them the feedback that we should, that might sharpen their performance. And that's what happened, is that a new manager came in, got eyes on everybody, didn't have the same bank account because she was brand new. So it was like first dating everybody. And it didn't take her long to be like, well, these two, like, what is, not that they were the worst, but she's like, they're
just not as good as everybody says.
Yeah. That's like, they missed this and they missed this. And yeah, it was basically new
eyes,
ways of doing. Yeah. And she was right. And as soon as she said it, she was so immediately right in what she was saying, because I'd had eyes on the company for a long time too. And I was not bamboozled, but, I had the same bias from the stories because I remember them staying up all night and pulling out this victory and meeting this deadline.
It doesn't have to be intentional to be a problem. It could just be that
the breaks,
right?
The way things broke,
right?
Yeah,
that they did a great job staying up all night that time, and then after that, maybe they could have used some feedback, and they were trying their best, but just got lulled into believing that it was good.
Yeah. I'll tell it's it's a true story. And so this kind of combines a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about today. And so I may miss some of the precise details, but all this stuff happened and you can look it all up. The first year that Tom Landry was the coach of the Dallas Cowboys, they basically won like no games.
It was not a good performance.
Terrible season. And Tom Landry then at the end of the season was asked to report to the, I can't remember if it's the owner or general manager, but a guy named Tex Schramm. I think it was Tex Schramm. So again, I may have some of the details wrong, but he's like, look, I gave it a shot. Didn't go my way. He had graduated years prior from the University of Texas with a petroleum engineering degree. And he was a pilot in World War II in the Army Air Corps. And so he'd done some stuff. He'd had a life as a short life during World War II as a pilot, and a short career, I should say. And then he had this experience of being a petroleum engineer for a little bit. And so as he's walking down the long corridor to the general manager's office, in his head, he's telling himself, hey, it'll be okay. I didn't mind petroleum engineering. I think I was a decent petroleum engineer. I'll go back to that. It'll be fine. And as he gets into the general manager's office, Tex Schramm turns a piece of paper around and pushes it to him. And Landry takes out his pen, like going to sign his resignation. And he gets down there and it's a contract extension for 5 years. And Tex Schramm says, I know that we had bad luck this year, but I believe in what you're doing. We're going to keep you around long enough to be able to implement your system and pull it off. And the rest of the story is the guy became probably the most famous coach of the Cowboys, stayed for, 20 years, something like that. They have part of the freeway in Dallas is named after the guy.
I had never noticed that.
Yeah, called Tom Landry Freeway. But it's a lot of the pieces we talked about today. Would have been easy to assume that guy is never going to be a football coach.
That happens a lot.
Yeah. That's goodwill account, a lot of negatives early. And, look, we understand sometimes the negatives early mean it's not a good fit. But that's our tendency to think that.
Well, and, it just crossed my mind as you were saying that. To some degree, we're pushed towards making that decision too, right? Like, it's much easier to fire somebody in the first 90 days.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that is impacting us feeling like we need to make an assessment, it's actually pushing towards the bias.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yep. The other thing I like about the story is also it has the identification component, the multiple role. This idea that be more than just one thing, right? And Tom Landry thought he was getting fired as a football coach, but he knew that he was also a petroleum engineer, and he knew that he'd also been a pilot. And so it wasn't quite so, the sting of what he thought was going to be losing one of those didn't make it quite so hard for the others. Yeah.
All right. We ready to wrap up?
Yeah. It's hard to see people accurately. Seeing people as accurately as we can is important to being a decent manager and giving people a fair shot. Just because it's hard and complicated doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to see people and their performance as it is instead of how we perceive it is. And we talked about a number of the ways that our perceptions can go wrong. That's why we wanted to do this episode. The science, talked about a lot of science beneath all this, fundamental attribution error, goodwill accounts / idiosyncrasy credits, confirmation bias, identification a little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah. And that's it.
All right, that's it for Management Muse, and we appreciate you listening, and we would really appreciate if you like, share, star, I don't know, all the
all
stuff.
Of it. Get us out
Whatever.
of the thicket of all these other nasty podcasts nipping at our ankles. We need to break out of the stratosphere, people. Escape velocity.
Appreciate you. See you next time.
Catch you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to learn more about the topic, check out our show notes. And if you want to help us out, like, share, subscribe, and 5 stars are all deeply appreciated. See you next time on the Management Muse.